Hey there, this is Matt at State of Flux, and I want to do a discourse video surrounding Emilia Perez. I'm going to sort of make some bold statements up front that you may not necessarily agree with, but I want to sort of give my point of view on all of this. So if you are going to respond, and you're welcome to do so, I actually encourage it, that's actually kind of what this video is about, please wait until you've listened to the whole video to provide said response, because I do think that that's part of how criticism works. We'll touch on that as we go. But yeah, I saw Emilia Perez in the very end of November. I think I got my review up on early December. And I originally gave that film a 4-star out of 4-star review. I loved the movie, though I did highlight that there are some criticisms that could be levied against the film that I think are valid and potentially harmful to certain aspects of how one would view the film. But I still thought it was excellent filmmaking across the board anyway and was willing to forgive it. In the time since I watched this film, it has been nominated for 13 Academy Awards, and there have been multitudinous think pieces written about how this is not only a bad movie, but possibly the worst movie to ever be nominated for Best Picture. And I couldn't believe the response to a lot of this, because in my opinion, I think a film can be flawed but also great. And we're going to touch on that more towards the end as well, because I think there are a couple key examples of that, including one that is a Best Picture winner that I think most people still even today think is one of the best movies the year it came out. Again, we'll touch on that as we move along, but I wanted to take some time to address some of these criticisms, because after it was nominated for all these awards, I went back and I rewatched it. I wanted to see from other people's perspectives, having read the reviews by this point from other people, and see where they were coming from, or if this was coming from a disingenuous place. And I think certain aspects are, but certain aspects aren't, and I don't want to dismiss that. I'm going to be talking mostly about the film specific, and not necessarily about what has come out after the film very publicly was nominated for the Oscars, and how it kind of shot itself in every kind of foot that it has to win any of those Oscars, besides Zoe Saldana, who appears to be a lock. I will touch on some of those, because I think there's validity in that too. But I want to focus my energies on the criticism of the film itself. I originally saw this film at the end of December, the end of November, beginning of December. I got my review up online. And prior to having seen it, I just heard that it was like one of those critical darlings that came out of the Cannes Film Festival, placing, I want to say, 3rd. And it was a generally beloved film with great performances, and it was just an offbeat film that you don't traditionally see. And that was kind of all I knew going in. And at the time, I think Rotten Tomatoes had it around 81%. I think since then it's dropped down to about 76, last I checked, from the critical community. And I watched that film and I gave it 4 stars. You can hear my review, but even in my review I did talk about how I thought the film had certain damning aspects of it that some people might take umbrage with, particularly when talking about the trans narrative. Now, that's the first kind of talking point I really wanted to address, because representation has been brought into question since the film has had its wide release, so to speak, on Netflix. And not only with regards to the trans experience, but also from the Mexican population, or allies thereof. And let's first talk about the trans experience. Even in my review, I highlighted that this does utilize some unsavory tropes associated with the trans experience in storytelling. And I'll touch on the spoiler aspect of that here, so this is your warning, spoilers, but part of that is the inclusion of the death of the trans character. A lot of these storylines do end rather tragically, and there's little to no hope or optimism there, which is a pretty damning message to throw out there. But I think more to the point, the real issue here is that, well, yes, it is true that this film does utilize that. That's only viewing it from the perspective of this is a trans story, but that's not all Emilia Perez is. Emilia Perez is also a crime thriller musical drama, and part of the crime thriller experience is you see somebody who was bad or still is bad, usually gets toppled and gets some kind of comeuppance by the end. And that is an accepted trope within that storytelling. And being that this film is about a crime lord who undergoes transition and sort of reframes her life after the fact, is something that is scrutinized pretty heavily from one perspective, but not from the other. I can liken this to another criticism that was hurled at a film that I really liked, a lot of people did, but that would be Wonder Woman. When the first Wonder Woman came out, the people who didn't criticize it for its ending being Zack Snyder-y nonsense and like you throw away your good story for a big action battle at the end. The other criticism that typically was laid towards this film from a lot of like feminist think pieces at the time was that as a feminist feature, it is pretty weak sauce. And that's because at the end of the day, Wonder Woman is a movie wherein a naive young woman has to be shown the real world by a male who is the moral compass of the story. And some feminists took umbrage with that, and I agree, from a feminist perspective, that isn't a great look. There are great feminist moments, including the amazing No Man's Land scene in that film, but it is pretty inescapable to not see that perspective while watching Wonder Woman. However, that's only watching Wonder Woman from a strictly feminist lens, because if you're watching it from the lens of superhero storytelling, you also often get within those films a side character or mentor figure who is there to act as a moral compass and show the hero how to live in a moral way within the world that's presented to them. It's your Alfred figure or your Yinsen in Iron Man. And so when you look at Wonder Woman from that perspective, those are traditions in most superhero stories that aren't often criticized. And so I feel like while the criticism is in place and effective, it's true, it is a truism, it's also looking at it from a relatively myopic lens because the movie is more than just one thing. And I think really the problem is the fact that when you have a film that is representative of an underrepresented population. At the time, Wonder Woman was really the only female-led superhero film that had been in existence for almost 15 to 20 years at that point. And just as this trans narrative is one of the very few that's in existence in a huge wide-scale release, people have a tendency to want not only that representation to exist, it needs to be the perfect representation. So if it's not, there's a tendency to over-scrutinize and say that this is good, but it's not good enough. And it's not long before the internet and the way that the algorithms work to turn that this isn't great representation to this is flat out bad or awful or damaging or harmful or any number of things. And while that could be true from certain perspectives, and I don't necessarily disagree, I think that's only looking at it from one perspective, because looking at it from a crime thriller perspective, that is kind of the expected endpoint for your titular character. From the perspective of the Mexican population, that this is a bad representation of Mexico, this is a frustrating depiction of cartel life, or mitigating the earnest sincerity that exists within the problems of cartel life and cartels or whatever in Mexico. That's a little harder to navigate because on one hand, you go into a film accepting whatever the film is going to present you on some level. So if you're going into this film knowing it is a musical about a cartel drug lord who is going under transition to upend and change her life for the better, you are expecting to see a certain thing. And I think the mere existence that there is a musical about a former cartel drug lord that isn't immediately and instantly vilified as the absolute worst possible person in the world is where some people struggle. And I get that. This is very dealing with very real things in our news landscape that have been in existence for eons at this point. And it's people feel like they're treating this lightly or aloofly, and if that's how they feel, I respect that, and I can get behind that. I can see that issue. I didn't have that issue watching it the first time, but watching it the second time, I will say that the very first thing you see to let you know that you are in Mexico is a stereotypical mariachi standing there for no other reason other than to just set the tone of or set the landscape for where you're at. Like, oh, we're in Mexico because of this. And I think a lot of that stems from a problematic filmmaker who helmed the movie, who is nominated for Best Director. It has since come out that he chose not to go to Mexico for any type of research. The film was filming, I believe, France for Mexico, which a lot of other films have done too. So like movies do that all the time. Change out the landscape, say it's a different place. So I'm not going to take too much umbrage with that. But the fact that he refused to go to Mexico for any kind of research because he needed everything, or he knew everything he needed to know from the script is pretty problematic, and willful ignorance is not a good look and not a good usage of anybody's time. I think you do get to a place where you set up stereotypes such as the mariachi for creative shorthand to let people know where you are, for no other reason than to just do it. You have no other in on that to let people know where you're at. And I think that is pretty jarring and ineffective, and I can understand and embrace that criticism. However, I do think a film can be flawed, but still good, if not even great. I think that this is something that you see from time to time, where if a movie has a very noticeable flaw, like this, like Avatar is one that comes to mind as well, with its depiction of the blue cat people being essentially Native Americans and whatnot. There's a backlash to that that's instant, and therefore the movie is terrible. But I don't think that's the case or helpful, because there's no learning from that. If you just immediately strike it down, there's no learning, there's no changing. And I think if Avatar is also a good example of this, Avatar 2 worked to change that or justify its depiction of that in the first one in interesting and meaningful ways. Whereas I think this is more of a moment to devise a conversation with the movie and say, hey, this is a very good movie. It was probably unwise or misguided to have the trans experience boiled down to this one aspect, and that's not a great look. That may not age well over time, but still recognize the filmic technique at hand as being something that's really quite good. To immediately just strip everything away from the film as if it's just the worst because of one aspect or two aspects is pretty unhelpful. And I don't think it gets a conversation going. I think it just gets people jumping on a bandwagon of like, oh, you don't think this movie's good? Let's see what else we can tear it apart for. And that's not helpful. because at the end of the day, I do think representation matters, and I think that the lesson that studios are going to get from that is that maybe we shouldn't make a movie that depicts the trans experience to this scale, or maybe not at all, or at least pause it for 10 years or whatever, and make people forget, or not apply this big of a budget to it, or this big of stars to it, or this amount of prestige to it. And I think that is, I would rather have a flawed representation than no representation at the end of the day. Because a conversation is important. There are other aspects of the film that people have kind of picked at. I've heard that this is a musical with no good songs, and I disagree wholeheartedly with that. Right after watching it the very first time, I added 4 songs right into my phone instantly, 2 of which got Oscar nominations. But I think the songs are good. I also lived with a woman from Chile, and I'm used to listening to Latin music and whatnot, and it could be that because of this, I'm listening to music quite often in my life where I don't understand the language, and I just learn to adapt and listen to music that I don't understand the lyrics to. And so I'm much more receptive to a film like that, and this could be a situation where the people who watched it and dismissed the music the first time might not listen to music in other languages. Or the fact that this is a musical that doesn't have bops like Wicked or Greatest Showman or something like that, that are clearly defined musical songs, and is something more along the lines of Les Mis or Sweeney Todd, where it's a lot of spoken dialogue done lyrically. And it could be that that's a turnoff for them. But I urge those people to maybe just watch it again 2 times, or just listen to the music again 2 times until you kind of get used to what the sound of it is, and then you will probably respond better to it. I think another component that people have been dinging the film on is how terrible it looks, and I disagree. I do think that the film is underlit, but where the lighting is, I think the lighting is effective. And it's also boiling into that crime thriller aspect of the film, which is that oftentimes crime thrillers are dark, underlit, and it's trying to go for like a modern noir aesthetic, but painting the visual canvas with sort of murky browns and earth tones and stuff like that, rather than black and white. It is a modern aesthetic of the noir that it's going for. And so I can see, if you're watching it from the perspective of this is a musical or something like that, no, it isn't going to be bright. It is going to be somewhat dingy and stuff like that. But it worked for me. I thought it looked really good. Since the movie came out, with all of its Oscar nominations, the filmmakers have worked their damnedest to make sure this film gets buried and doesn't see anybody's eyeballs pretty much ever again, because of all the scrutiny that it's under. People are scrutinizing the people involved, and you get the interview with the director where he chose willful ignorance over like authenticity. It's also where you got the extreme scrutinization of Carla Sofia Gascon, who does give a tremendous performance in this film, but she had a pretty wicked experience all throughout Twitter, where she put into the world some pretty hateful and hurtful and dirty and gross things and thoughts and stuff. And she's essentially dropped out from the Oscar race, and is kind of there sort of in name only. But given what you know about the people involved, it is a lot harder to go back and watch something like this. And I do think that like the whole, you have to reconcile with the death of the author to engage with a piece of work, there's some truth with that. I do think that the work speaks for itself, so to speak, as well, regardless of authorial intent and whatnot. But it has made it hard for me to go back, and I did watch the film after everything, all the Twitter comments that she painted as if, oh, that happened so long ago. It happened in like 2020. She had stuff to say about George Floyd, which was pretty reckless and gross. But it made it a lot harder to even find the will to rewatch the film, but I like to give everything I view at least 2 watches before I fully determine where I stand with something. And at the end of the day, my opinion on the film didn't change. I still think the movie is very good. It is flawed, but I've seen flawed Best Picture nominees and winners before. I think one of my favorite winners of the Best Picture is Silence of the Lambs, which, when viewed from a LGBTQ perspective, the film is pretty damaging, incredibly damaging, and you could write it off and say, hey, this is dated, but I don't feel like that is a good argument, because those were problems that were active during the time of that film's release that were pretty damaging to the gay community. It was problematic then. It's more vocal now, but I remember having some of those same issues when I saw the film in the late 90s with how the gay community was being, or the straight up homophobia of it all, I guess. And the other one, the elephant in the room, would be Psycho, right? That is pretty damaging, yet we can accept these very flawed masterpieces as being good. And I'm not saying that Emilia Perez is as good a film as Psycho or Silence of the Lambs, but if we can accept quality from those films, that sure, Psycho, maybe you can excuse that, like, it was dated, we hadn't really thought it or dissected. Silence of the Lambs was problematic when it came out, and yet it was embraced wholeheartedly without the backlash. And if we can accept those as being great, we can accept the flaws within Emilia Perez and use them as discussion points. Don't end the conversation by saying, bah, that film was horseshit. Actually take the time and discuss it with people who do like it, and maybe have a conversation there. These are conversation starters. I think that's what criticism is for. It is to engage with the work that you're watching and recognize qualities and flaws. The greatest films out there have pretty damning things in it. One of my favorite films is the film Aliens. I love that movie, but that is a pretty damaging film when you see a film that is like an analog for the Vietnam War. Well, then aren't you reducing the Viet Cong to beasts or inhuman? Like, there are issues you can take with your favorite media and still love and respect that media. And that's where conversation comes into play. And that's where I land. So I still love Emilia Perez. I still give it 4 stars. It's still on my top 10 list, though it's fallen quite a bit, and that's not because I thought less of this film. It's because I've watched a lot of other movies that have really moved on up that list. But where do you land in this? If you take umbrage with anything I have to say, please let me know in the comments down below. I would like this to be a conversation, and I might like to explore this with other films. Or if there are films that you've seen that you really want to have that conversation for, please let me know, and maybe I can set up something for that. But I don't think that just shitting on something is particularly helpful. And, yeah. Anyway, I'm rambling. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Peace.